Contrary to popular belief, leaders are not all cut from the same cloth. They are not all alike. They don't think alike. They don't approach things alike because they're different people. They don't share the same personality, and they rarely have the same kind of background. Some aspire to leadership early on in life. Others lead because they must. They don't always take the same path. In fact, rarely do they do that. And they don't always approach leadership in exactly the same way. Leaders all have different strengths, different weaknesses. However, regardless of the personalities involved, their backgrounds, their strengths, or their weaknesses, all leaders must, one way or another, learn to communicate with the people that they lead. This is essential. There's no way getting around it. And yet, it is something that we don't really do much training on in the church. Well, in Nehemiah's day, as recorded in Nehemiah 12, as the people settled in to Jerusalem, Nehemiah identified the leaders among the priests and Levites. As one of the things, as they came down to the conclusion of that work, he did. Why? To ensure the work in the temple would continue, first of all, according to the law. Also, though, to celebrate the completion of the building of the wall of Jerusalem on a particular occasion, as what we found here. And then, thirdly, to make sure that the work of the Levites and the worship led by the priests would receive support financially and otherwise from the people. Now, to accomplish all this, it required the cooperation of the people involved and a knowledge and understanding on the part of everyone at every level. And his goal in doing this was to affect the whole of the nation for generations beyond himself. But if he was going to do that, what is implied in almost everything that is accomplished is he had to communicate. For people to know that this was what he wanted, it had to become something beyond him and reach ultimately all the people that would be affected by it. Communication is key in leadership because for people to follow, they must know where to go and what to do. If you don't know where to go, if you're never told, you're not going to ever get there. If you don't know what to do, you can't do it. And so that must be communicated. But more than this, communication is also how leaders bring individual people from various backgrounds themselves together as a unit to one understanding, to one goal, to one purpose, in order to work together for something that's greater than something just individually. That's the goal. Nehemiah understood that, and what he and the other leaders did in Nehemiah 12 reminds us of the value of communication for leaders today. The thing is that when you're going through and looking at all this, the first thing we need to consider is that even organizations with a long history connecting them, they've got to reestablish their identity from time to time and from generation to generation. Because as new people enter in, it affects how people see things, and they don't always come with the same assumptions, background, and interest, and they don't come with the same knowledge of what you do as everyone else. When people enter in, they're coming into a new environment, and they're bringing their own environment with them. And we can forget this, that they need to have things communicated to them, is that this is what we're about. To pull people together as one, leaders must ensure that everyone, regardless of how long they've been there, how well they're known, what their involvement level is, regardless of that background and environment, that they understand what, as a unit, the people, what this is all about. So if you're talking about a business, that has to be communicated. Here's what we do. Here's why we exist. Here's why what you do matters. But as a congregation of God's people, here's who we are. Here's why we are what we do. And here's why we do the things the way we do them. All of that has to be developed and then discussed for people to understand them. Leaders cannot take it for granted that people just automatically pick up on, let's say this together now, how we do things. People don't just pick up on that. They ask the question, well, that's different. Why? What matters to us most? That has to be communicated. And also, Why is this special? People need to know that. They're not going to know it on their own. It needs to be communicated. Leaders have the responsibility to communicate these things to the people they lead, to do it regularly, to do it corporately, and also to do it personally. All of these things have to be there to make sure that there are no gaps in understanding to make this process work. And so when you're thinking about what has to be communicated, leaders must communicate the history, the principles, and the values that they expect people to know and respond to. What makes you different? That you're not just the same as everyone else, but why? And you know what's funny is a lot of times people themselves don't know. And it requires some reflection of why are we different? What are we about? Why are we different from that congregation down the road that we do stuff with? What makes us different? How are we like this? And so it begins by recognizing for us the nature of the church. But it doesn't end there. In Ephesians chapter 4, verses 4 through 6, there, Paul laid out these 7 principles of unity when he said that there's one body and one spirit, even as you're called in one hope of your calling, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who's above all and through all and in you all. And to be able to lay these out and say, one by point, what each one means and why it matters to us. That's the foundational principles of appreciating why we all came together to accept all these things, that this is what we stand for, this is who we are, it's what identifies us as the Lord's people, and it matters. But every congregation has its own culture, its own traditions, and also its own kind of feel. You ever go somewhere, it feels different here. Why? Everything they do is exactly no scriptural differences. We covered that already. But it just has a different feel. Why? There's a personality to a group of people. Why? Because the church is made up of a group of personalities. So if you walk into a dull congregation, what are you thinking? Those people are dull. Right? Boy, those people are friendly. It's different, but it matters. Now think about it in Revelation 2 and 3, meaning chapters 2 and 3. There are 7 congregations mentioned. They had different strengths, different weaknesses, different problems, and also a different makeup. He talked to them in different ways. He talked about, Ephesus, y'all are doing a lot of things right, but man, it's kind of cold. Smyrna, hang in there, people. Y'all are great. Pergamos, y'all need to wake up about what's going on here. Laodicea, I'm this close, people. Right? There are different situations they found. Some doctrinal, but some it was just the personality of, well, that can confuse people if they're unprepared for it. For example, why would anybody automatically know what Bible classes are to do during a gospel meeting? What Bible classes are supposed to do during the summer series? Who do I talk to get involved in visitation? Well, since y'all aren't mind readers right now, then recognize no one else is either. That has to be communicated. It may even go down to things like, why can't my co-worker's sister's daughter have her baby shower in your annex? Well, they all need to think about that one. There are reasons why, but they have to be communicated. They cannot be prepared, that is, people cannot be prepared unless leaders communicate what they need to be prepared to understand and do. Has to be there. But also, the leaders have to communicate interest. Leaders must develop a collective identity where being interested in others is an essential part of the culture. And by the way, leaders, that begins with you. Philippians chapter 2 and verse 4. Look not every man on his own things, but every man also on the things of others. That is key to understand that there is interest, genuine individual interest there. So it means then communicating the need to engage people, including and maybe even especially outsiders, in conversation to share ideas. Where you don't all huddle up in your own little groups with the same people every week. You know who you are. All right? Everybody has certain people you talk to every week, every time you're here, just about. You know what that also means? There are certain people you never talk to. Now, that may be because they don't want to talk to you. They're already talking to other people. But there are always going to be people that are left out if we don't engage them. That has to be part of the interest. Why you engage them? Because you're interested in them. That has to be an inviting atmosphere that is developed also through open and consistent hospitality. so that there is a culture so that people are interested, and it's communicated, notice, in a number of ways. It's not just words we say, it's things we do. It's movements we make to come over here and let's have a conversation. Let's talk about this. What do you do? Where do you work? What is going on? Hey, then it's action. Let's go out and share a meal together. These are all methods of communication to get across what is a consistent message of interest. And that means then doing everything you can to include others. Not just in the outer trappings of the congregational culture, but the inner workings too. It's one of those things we can't assume, trust me, just being in this hall, auditorium, whatever you want to call it, this is not enough for people to get the message about what we're about. If this is all we're about, people are going to have a very limited, shallow view of us. They need more. We have to give it to them. Therefore, receive one another just as Christ also received us to the glory of God. There ought to be a welcoming to it, to where people know that they are welcome to be with us. And by the way, the best way, not just welcome to be somewhere here, you're welcome to be right next to me. And think about that, communicated beginning with the leadership, that everyone's welcome right here by my side. You've got to let people know that. They've got to see that, and then they can do it too. The more open you are with people at every level, the easier they will be able and feel comfortable responding to you at every level as a leader. You also need to communicate belonging. This ties in with the previous. For people to identify with the culture, they've got to feel like they are loved and that they belong here. Finally, all of you be of one mind, having compassion one for another. Love as brothers, be tenderhearted, be courteous. That's 1 Peter 3 and verse 8. And so leaders must make sure that these are communicated without fail, both by doing them, but also communicated, this is what we are. If they're developing an overall culture, that culture has to be communicated. And it's done individually, it's done as a whole, and by a behavior that is approved. You see, belonging just doesn't develop right. I mean, if I were to look right now and say, do y'all belong together? Well, you are together, but is that what makes you belong together? There are plenty of times I've gone to football games, I've gone to concerts, and I didn't belong with any people there. Felt like an outsider the whole time. That's a lot of times how people are going to feel when they come and they sit right here. Until it is communicated to them otherwise and given reasons why they should feel like they belong. Leaders have to make sure their communication then extends beyond the auditorium. If this is the only time in which communication is made, it ends up being stiff and not taken as genuine as it would outside the auditorium. That's why it has to be caring conversation, meaningful visitation, and open discussion. It is in this more personal manner that now we can see who the people are, not just what the people are. You see, you don't want to belong to a what, but you do want to belong to who. And that makes a big difference. So, if you do not actively communicate your identity and culture to the people, leaders, your identity and culture will drift to suit the people who are there. It depends on whether or not you are in control of the culture and leading the culture, or the people are leading the culture, and you have to respond to it. Second of all, leaders, you need to communicate responsibilities and roles. Now, when Nehemiah, after that list that he gave all the people in their earlier about why you belong here, and then he's going to bring people in, he gave them certain responsibilities for that celebration of the wall. We live in a society that has become extremely passive about a number of things. Society has encouraged this, I think mostly incidentally, but through passive learning at school, where you just sit and do nothing but just respond when you have to. And even by now, technology has made us passive. We're to the point of where rather than going to look something up, we just go over and we say, hey, Alexa. You know? There's a thin line between technology helping us and we just becoming lazy bums, people. And it encourages us to be so passive that we don't become active in the rest of life, and then the church is affected. So for an organization to be active in living, so must its people be. This congregation is only as living and acting as you are as an individual when we put it all together. And to accomplish anything well, then, all the people here have to understand roles and responsibilities. So I ask you, everyone, how well do you understand your role and your responsibility as a member of this congregation? What is your place here? What do you contribute? Why? What's expected of you? That's what we're going to be talking about, because if they don't know, it hasn't been communicated. Now, it takes two for communication. So if you're sitting there plugging up your ears all the time, it doesn't help. But it has to go out there. This doesn't come automatically, especially when people are new. It doesn't just happen. So Nehemiah called people together. It was for the celebration of the completion of this wall, and they were doing it to thank God for that. But in the process, he gave them roles that were appropriate and meaningful. What do you need to communicate then in these times? First of all, value. Before anyone is likely to accept a role, he needs to value the role. There's a big difference between the person who gets the job because nobody else will take that job. Oh, I always think of earlier in Nehemiah 3 that the poor person who got his assignment, they're going out, and they're getting the assignment. Okay, now, it's your turn, Joab. Oh, look, you drew the dung gate. That's worse than being selected the final person in PE. You got a value. What happened? But it got built. Why? Because that person understood the value of why this had to be built. Because he saw it as part of a whole. And that is exactly what you have to do, is to communicate value. Otherwise, without the value, you'll never seek excellence in doing the job you were given, in the role and responsibility you have. And that is why leaders must appreciate themselves the value of every role performed, because that's how they're going to be able to get it across to people that are in those roles. Leaders, if you don't understand why what they're doing is valuable, how do you expect them to? They need to understand it. If the foot should say, because I'm not a hand, I'm not of the body, is it therefore not of the body? 1 Corinthians 12, verse 15. And a lot of times I think what we see is people not understanding why what they do matters, and they're really saying this. I'm not really of the body. Because they don't understand why what they're doing matters. If a leader does not appreciate the role, it makes it hard for the person fulfilling it to do so. It's kind of the same thing about the person who is supposed to, and I don't know if it's apocryphal or not, but he was told that you needed to like this all the time, and he did it, and no one ever bothered to tell him why, and he just one day got tired, decided not to bother it, and that ended up as if you're operating a lighthouse or some of the lights along the shore, it can cost people. But if he doesn't know that, that's why. Then it wasn't any big deal not to do it. It has to be communicated. So let's take an example of this. In a door-knocking campaign, for instance, you need people mapping out where to go each day. People to knock on the doors, helpers to walk with them, people driving them to locations to provide water, people hosting helpers in their homes, people providing meals for those who are working, people to organize the information gathered, people to conduct Bible studies, people handling correspondence courses, and that isn't everyone. And you drop the ball on any one of these, guess what? It could be the difference in a soul saved and a soul lost. With any one of those things not really being done well. This is just one example of the work that we do that requires people. Everyone's seeing, I've got a role, I've got a place, but we have to put it together to say this is why it's valuable. This contribution, this meal is feeding someone who's talking to people who might one day get a Bible study and talk to this person and then obey the gospel. Don't undervalue the meal. That means then everyone here has responsibilities. We may not be looking for them, we may not appreciate them, but you have them. If you do not know what they are, that's a problem, and you need to talk to a leader. Leaders, you need to communicate expectations too. Most places have a pretty good history of plugging people into roles. At least what my experience is, that's not the issue. What we're not so good at is communicating the expectations of these roles. That is, here's your role, what are you supposed to do with it? And this is important because how is anyone to know whether they're doing well, doing poorly, or not even doing if there are no expectations? How are you to know? What are the expectations of you as a Bible class teacher? Well, I'm to go over this lesson. Why? What if you don't? Why that lesson? What's your end game? What are you trying to accomplish with this child, with this class? Don't you know? This is true in principle regardless of the role. Preachers, elders, deacons, teachers, secretaries, custodians, personal workers, helpers, everyone needs to know what's expected. When you read in Paul writing to Titus, it's interesting because Paul has left Titus in Crete. He writes the letter then to remind him why he left him there. And to say, here's the expectations I have of you now that you're in Titus. You realize that's really what's going on there? What are you supposed to be doing? You're supposed to be going around appointing elders. By the way, that was an important responsibility to him to recognize who was qualified, who was not, and to make sure the right men were put in. Make sure then that you deal with this other problem over here, and then you solidify everyone in the proper roles and get the lives right. Straightforward, but there were expectations. You could go and look at what Titus did, compare it to what Paul wrote in Titus, in that book, and you know if he did a good job or not. He would know if he did what he was supposed to do or not. And that is exactly what is needed more in giving people the right expectations. This lack of specific expectations and then the accountability to meet them is the greatest motivation for doing nothing that there is. If there are no expectations, then why do I do this? Because I'm still doing exactly what's expected of me. See? And this also means that leaders have no right to criticize or complain at the outcome if the expectations aren't put on the table. So leaders have to be diligent 3 ways. Understanding the roles and responsibilities that they assign others. 2, communicating expectations. And then 3, making sure people have what they need to be successful. That last part's important too. Don't assign something to someone and hold them accountable to something that you don't allow them to actually fulfill. Anything else, though, is doomed to certain uncertainty. At the very least. Conflict is very likely because when you don't set out expectations, everybody has different expectations. You meet, and your expectations don't match up, and guess what you get? Conflict. And no matter what, you're going to get failure in the end, one way or another, because of that. But then, there also needs to be a communication of appreciation for a job well done. That's part of this too. Appreciation is something that most people feel often but communicate seldom. So now you think about this, before you think about the leaders, you think about this, people. How many times you feel thankful but never say anything to the person about being thankful? Just think about it. In Philemon, verses 4 through 7, before Paul got to his specific request, he talked about Philemon and how thankful he was for various aspects of Philemon's character and what he'd done. He put all that up front. You know, this can be the case for leaders too, especially due to the busyness and the burden that comes with the role. But expressing appreciation for people, filling roles, remember, that we cannot or do not perform, that's part of this, and carrying out responsibilities that would otherwise overwhelm, that's what the apostles were doing in Acts chapter 6, especially when people do them well, that ought to be automatic. It ought to be regular, it ought to be specific. You did this, thank you so much, because there was no way we could get around to that, and you saved us on this. Wow, that matters. Look what a difference you made by taking care of this that we couldn't otherwise do. You know, you can think you're repeating yourself, that it is rare that sincere appreciation is not in return appreciated. It is very rare. It is sad how many times that kind words that we have to say occur at a person's funeral, but not in their presence. And we need to become a congregation that are getting used to this, of being willing to say thank you for a lot of things. I'll start right now. I'll help you out. Thank you for putting up with me for over 13 years. Not taken for granted here. Thank you. And there are a lot of things that need to be said more often. Matter of fact, sometimes do you ever feel like you need to say thank you about every year to someone for something they've done? I do. Why don't we? And yet communicating appreciation, you realize, is one of the greatest motivators available to leaders. Because when you feel appreciated, you are motivated to be involved and work. When you don't feel appreciated, you don't. Learn to use this and people will find their roles more rewarding than ever. They'll feel it. They'll feel a connection to the work, to what their job is, and to you because you took the trouble to say thank you. The greater the role, the greater the responsibility will be. The greater the responsibility, the greater the accountability must be. The greater the accountability, the greater the appreciation should be. Thirdly, communicate purpose. In the last section of Nehemiah chapter 12, in World War II, manufacturers talked to their employees about how their work made an impact on the war. Now, you're talking about people who never saw fighting in any way. They knew people, but they never saw it. Their involvement, their attention to detail, and the quality of their work saved lives. Whether they were building ships so well and so quickly that no one could imagine how fast they could put it together. Making different things to, you think about how much the ammunition had to be turned out and weapons. Making sure parachutes were sewn so they'd be safe. They had a purpose then that transcended the daily grind of the job. That's what their manufacturers were communicating to the people. And that's still true in many ways today. We just don't communicate it like we need to. And that's what leaders need to communicate, to get people to see their work as participation in something much bigger than the grind. So how do you do that? You communicate big ideas. In that process, highlight how we, the whole, can make a difference in a big way. But to do that, you have to dream big. You have to think big. Acts chapter 17, verse 6, it was reported or described to the church, these are those who have turned the world upside down, and they've come here too. Now I ask you, you ever heard that said in your lifetime of the church? We are not turning the world upside down, and it begins with this, because we are not challenging ourselves to turn the world upside down. Think about being who everyone is talking about in town, in the state, in the country, in the world. And be those people. Think about growing exponentially in just a few years because you're willing to do what it takes. Think about all the people in this country that need the gospel and just might listen. Think about what impact our youth could have if we trained them to have that impact. Think big. We've got to think beyond the walls of the building. We've got to think of ourselves beyond the walls of the building and see the church and see our mission is beyond here. But that means communicating with a laser-like focus, not just you, but to them. Leaders have to explain how each activity and objective accomplishes something that has the potential to be extraordinary. Now, that can be pretty difficult sometimes. If you'll do this small little thing, if you'll put this screw in that hole and really tighten it well, boy, that would be extraordinary. But in the right context, it is. And that context is a lot of times what people need to hear. To do that, then, focus with clarity on what they need to do and can do right then. For example, every Bible class, every week, should try to make a big difference in students' lives for the rest of their lives. You're not always going to, teachers. But shouldn't we want to? Paul and Barnabas also remained in Antioch, teaching and preaching the word of the Lord with many others. Acts chapter 15:35. Did they make a difference doing that? Yes, they did. What are we supposed to be doing? After you go out and you create these disciples by their being baptized, you are then to teach them all things, whatsoever I've commanded you. You're listening to the Lord. Matthew 28, verse 19. Every time we worship is an opportunity to anticipate heaven. John 4, verse 24. Every door we knock, every person we greet, every tract we hand out, every mailer we send might be the difference between a person being lost and being saved. Mark 16, 15, and 16. That's our job. Go ye into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved, but he that believeth not shall be damned. That's focus. Every time we help someone, it might change how they see the Lord's church and plant a seed. Galatians 6 and verse 10. And every time we get together, it is an opportunity to draw nearer to God, nearer to one another, and nearer to heaven. But we have to call on people to see it that way. Hebrews chapter 10, 24 and 25, the writer did his best to show us that. This is what it's about. But in our own way, we have to emphasize that, show it, encourage it, and make it real to people. Communicate significance. Encourage everyone's involvement by pointing out the significance of those individual contributions. Think in terms of people having significance because they do. Isn't it a lot easier to see significance in grand, big things? Wow, that was impressive. A huge, big event is not always as significant as a small, individual step taken if it's the right thing. One may be more noticeable, more public, grand on scale. The other might make the difference between life and death. There are a lot of things that make the news. Little things some people do to save a life don't always. But it's significant. We've got to learn to see that significance and honor that significance. Dorcas in Acts chapter 9. Here she is. She's doing good works, charitable deeds. And they're showing them to Peter. They were significant to those people. They mattered. And they ought to matter to us. What is small and even unnecessary to some people is essential and valuable to the Lord. When we move up to see things as he sees things, we'll start valuing the significance we can have and others have more. Remember, Jesus says, so a woman is crying and anointing his feet. He says, she did it for my burial. She hath done what she could. How many times did Jesus take someone who everyone else cast aside and point out they'd done far more than the person that thought they were so much and doing so wonderfully? One person was feeding Jesus. The other was weeping over him. Leaders must learn to see value and significance in this way and then communicate that to others to show they see just exactly how significant their good behavior is. And to do this, do it personally. Give individuals individual purpose and individual encouragement and praise, and they will get individual significance. Meaning a generic announcement of everyone's done great, I feel better now. But go up and talk to individuals. I saw what you did here, specific, look what you did. Wow, that was wonderful. Huge difference. Oh, it's not as much effort to be generic. It's kind of like the difference in saying at the end of every prayer, forgive us of all of our sins, versus naming them off. You start naming your specific sins, you'll see them as being more significant. And the opposite works well too. Make it personal to them by making it personal to you. The Lord grant mercy to the household of Onesiphorus, for he often refreshed me and was not afraid of or ashamed of my chains. 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 15. The more personal leaders make their praise and the more specific they are for the individual and to the individual, the more that's appreciated and the greater the relationship will be. And remember, leader is a leader because of a follower. That is a relationship. And all of this communication is designed to strengthen those relationships. Leaders, when your cause is worthwhile and your purpose significant, then those serving in the cause have a significant purpose too. Let them know it. Let them hear it. Let them see it in you. Then, not only will they know you value what they do, but they will value it even more. Communication is what helps people embrace being part of the whole and gladly participating as a result. Most people want to belong, but leaders need to guide them, teach them, and encourage them along the way to belong in the right way, the best way. And that's why communication is so essential to leadership. For any organization to move forward, the leadership must communicate internally and be united in their purpose, goals, and objectives. Meaning they have to communicate with other leaders. But to be successful, they must also communicate with everyone else. Leaders must commit to communicating the identity and culture that makes belonging something people will embrace, the responsibilities and role expected of everyone so that people can feel that they've contributed and know they've done what is expected. That's so they know what value that you see in them. And thirdly, the purpose and thinking behind decisions that impact them as a people. When leaders fail to communicate these things to the people, it leaves a vacuum of thought that encourages speculation and suspicion. What's going on? I'm not sure. Why are they doing that? Don't know. Instead, unity and activity can be accomplished when there's trust there because of communication. You can't do that in an atmosphere of doubt. But with active, positive communication, it preempts that problem and builds relationships that will last and help you in things you do for years. There are a number of ways to communicate. Leaders ought to use them all. Sometimes a private conversation works best, is important. Sometimes an announcement from the pulpit, that's sufficient. But it's not enough to just make information available. People have to understand why it should matter to them or they won't take it to heart. And that's why leaders have to communicate. Aren't we thankful that God has led the way in communicating to us? We talked about that this morning. And think about how important it was that He led us and leads us through communication. It's hard to communicate when you're having noise, right? When He gave the gospel, He was communicating so we could listen and respond. Romans 10, verse 17. When He gave us this, it was to build trust with Him. I'm trustworthy. Look what I'm willing to do for you. He did that with Egypt. He's done that with us in Jesus Christ. That's why we respond with trust to Him. John 8, verse 24. But it also has responsibilities. Repent. Acts chapter 17, verse 30. And it means we need to communicate too. That we are in. That's what confession is. I trust you, and other people ought to trust you too. But then it's also we obey. We begin that process by being immersed in water for the remission of our sins. Acts 2, verse 38. Say, I'm in, I belong, and I'm so glad. You see, now that person who's taken that road, that's a person ready to work, to belong, to participate, and they want to know what the leaders want. We look to God, we see what He's given us in the gospel, and we respond. He's given us the model time after time after time. And every portion of leadership in the church begins by individuals choosing to follow him. If you're ready to do that this evening, won't you please come while we stand and sing?